Hey guys, it's Leila from Ignite and I'm here with Jonny.
Hey everyone.
And in today's video, we're going to take you through the controversy that was the 2020 Module C paper for both the advanced and the standard students. But before we get into that, please do like and subscribe to our channel and click the bell for notifications. And if you're wanting more resources to help you navigate your way through your English studies, check out our website at Ignite HSC. But for now, let's get into today's video.
Okay, so we're going to discuss the fact that in 2020 for the HSC exam, the Module C question was exclusively a composition question. So it was a 20-mark question that asked you to compose only an imaginative piece of writing. So there's actually two elements to that.
Yep.
One, there's no reflection, and two, you could only write an imaginative piece of writing.
Yeah, so I guess what we're addressing in this video is how to safeguard yourself with your prepared responses for a situation where you have to do 20 marks worth of composition without the reflection, and also how to ensure that you're prepared to write either an imaginative or a discursive or a persuasive piece.
Yeah, and it's first of all worth mentioning that this was controversial because the new syllabus, which came into effect a couple of years ago, was meant to get rid of this idea of just composing a piece of writing on the spot and not being accountable for your creative decisions and actually just making something up on the spot without having studied other texts that might influence or inspire your writing.
Yeah.
They were trying to get rid of that.
Yeah.
That's why they brought in the reflection, so that you actually had to be accountable for what you wrote in the first piece and show that you had actually drawn upon a text that you studied and then implemented it in your own writing. It has far more purpose behind it, and it was a lot more difficult for people.
That's right, and I think it's worth noting at this point that that is really the rationale behind Module C, right? That we're looking at texts, we're unpacking what was incredibly effective about the way that they've been composed, and you're using that to influence your own compositions, be it creative or discursive or persuasive. Now, just because there was no reflection component within this or last year's paper does not mean that you negate that kind of fundamental basis of the module, which is to make sure that your compositions are informed by the text that you have written. But indeed, it would probably need to be clearer in your composition because you don't have the time and the reflection to justify those creative decisions that you have made. But yes, it was controversial. It seemed to undermine the very purpose of the change in the syllabus and, in fact, the implication of the Module C section, which wasn't actually in the HSC when Jonny and I did it ourselves. There was no creative section taught. It's completely new in that regard.
That's right, and just to hazard a guess at why they may have done that, it seems that internally a lot of schools, or basically all schools, will certainly have some assessment, whether it's the trials or a prior assessment, that does make you do a reflection.
That's right.
Often the hand-in assessments, I've noticed,
Yep.
that get you to actually hand in a reflection, and many of you may relate to that already if you've already done an assessment of that kind.
Yep.
Perhaps NESA is then challenging you in the final exam to actually take one of those styles that you are supposed to have learned and then put that into practice without the reflection. Nonetheless, it was unexpected, and it probably is still less likely than likely.
Yes.
But the point is, we've now seen that the precedent's been set.
Yeah.
You need to be prepared.
That's right. And it was, I would argue, a little bit unfair because NESA doesn't know what kinds of texts your school has taught you. So it's also warning to students, even if in class time you were only taught imaginative writing or discursive writing, you should still make sure on your own you do a bit of work looking at what are the key aspects of persuasive writing and studying a text for each of the different text types, because you might have to justify a composition on that. So even if your class teacher hasn't taught you all three, take it upon yourself to make sure that you're on top of that.
Yeah, and an important thing there is NESA have only prescribed 2 texts to be studied in every class. So a teacher only has to, under the guidelines, present 2 prescribed texts. Now, if both of those prescribed texts lend themselves heavily towards an imaginative piece, so say it's prose fiction, or perhaps you studied 2 speeches, that's clearly more persuasive. What we now know is, despite them giving you those 2, they're expecting you to extract out of those the elements and know how to apply them to all 3 text types, the imaginative, the discursive, and persuasive.
That's right.
So I think that's something you really need to take away. That when you're looking at those texts, try not to box them into one of those categories.
That's important.
For instance, if you are studying a speech, let's say by Orwell or someone like that, you don't want to only look at that as an example of persuasive writing. Even though, of course, that's what it lends itself to, that's what it is. It is a piece of persuasive writing. You need to actually learn to take away the stylistic elements and say, how could I apply these in an imaginative context? How could I apply these in a discursive composition? Because you are able to do that, you just need to practice doing that. So don't think that you now can't rely on those prescribed texts just because they favor one particular text type. You just need to think about and actually practice taking those stylistic elements and the techniques that the composer's using and use them in a different context. So you want to implement them in the imaginative or the discursive, even though you prefer using a persuasive for that particular text.
Yeah, and I guess a nice way of making sure you're prepared there is perhaps looking or having in your notes prepared one imaginative text that you've studied and then looking at either a persuasive or a discursive, because it's quite easy to use the persuasive and discursive features interchangeably, more so than using an imaginative piece to write persuasively in that way. So if you are looking to study two particular texts, making sure you have that combination is useful. But I think now perhaps we should take a step back and think about, okay, well, what if I'm not writing the reflection? How do I know that my prepared piece can satiate a response that's 10 marks, 12 marks, or 20 marks like it was in the exam? So I guess...
Yeah, well, I always recommend when you're in the drafting process, you still can pick your preferred text type to begin with. So let's start with that. You like imaginative writing, let's say, okay? So you draft an imaginative composition. You've taken about 2 stylistic elements from a prescribed text that perhaps that lends itself to that. I would draft then 32 minutes worth of a piece. So 32 minutes would take to write it out. That's an extended piece. That's what you now need to be prepared for, because 32 minutes would be for a 20-mark question. So let's say there was no reflection and you just got the composition question. I would say it needs to take you 32 minutes because that allows 8 minutes of that 40-minute allotment to actually think about that stimulus, think about the question, and answer it thoroughly. So that's the first step. What I then recommend is that you have a variation of that draft. This is just to deal with the 8, 10, 12, 20 mark discrepancies that we may get. If you're faced with a question that is 10 to 12 marks, let's say, which is probably the most popular combination, right? 10 or 12 with an 8 or 10 for the reflection. Let's say you get that and you've got your 32 minute. I would have from that 32 minute a line drawn somewhere, or a variation, you could say, with different elements from that original draft that would make up about a 20-minute draft or less. So 15 to 20-minute draft taken from that 32-minute, let's say. One good way of doing that is to make that extended draft and then have 2 good finishing points for the piece. That doesn't mean that there's an ending per se, because these are very short pieces. Imagine like it's a page or 2 out of a book. That's really what the piece is. It doesn't have to be a distinct end.
It's a moment in time.
Exactly. But so 2 good convenient spots to end the piece, right? I would have 2. One for the extended version, which is the full ending. And then I would have marked out a place where you could end it for a 10 to 12 mark question.
Yeah. So I guess what we're trying to iterate here is an efficient way of preparing for the exam. We don't want you writing 3 different creative pieces based on 3 different texts. Start with 1 to 2 core texts that you have studied and know how you would draw from these texts if you were to write the imaginative or the persuasive or the discursive. Or like Jonny mentioned, you could use the 1 and how that would filter into the 3 different types of writing. And then you start off with 1 primary draft that is incorporating the features and the forms from the text that you have studied. And then you have 3 variations of that draft. 1 for the 20 mark, 1 for the 10 mark, or 1 for the 12 mark. So you're not having to learn too much material. You have the one set piece you're learning, but depending on the mark allocation, it would be a different length. So always try and switch your mindset to what is most efficient. How am I going to go into the exam with the least amount of material to memorize, but material that is most adaptable? That's always the best way to approach the exam situation.
Exactly. And just to clarify here, that was step 1. So you take that imaginative composition in that example, have an extended version and a shorter version to deal with the mark discrepancies that may come up, right? The differences in the papers between a 10 mark and a 12 mark. That's not the end of the story though. As Leila mentioned, there's the persuasive question that could come. So you could get asked to write solely a persuasive. You know, often you get a choice, but as we've said, you could be asked solely for a persuasive or solely for a discursive. So if you've got that imaginative composition and you've got the extended version and the shorter version, you shouldn't feel safe yet. That's not enough. It's not enough to just take that and practice new stimuli with that imaginative.
That's right.
You should have an adapted version from that imaginative with similar concerns. This is the key. You don't want to write a whole new persuasive and a whole new discursive, but you want to have practice doing, let's just say, even a shorter version for each of them. Using the same concerns, the same speaker, I would advocate for. Keep a lot of elements as similar as you can. Keep them as similar as you can. and then write it in a persuasive form while still trying to use a couple of those elements that you initially took from the prescribed text. You may want to present it a bit differently to suit that persuasive format. So it's not enough to simply just take those elements and rewrite something else. It now needs to sound persuasive. So it's going to have less of those imaginative elements in terms of the character and the plot. It's going to be more didactic. You're going to be talking to someone. So you'll need to study up on those. And we will have videos on how to actually do a persuasive and how to do a discursive and an imaginative. But take a look at those at a different point in time. For now, just know that you do change the format generally. But let's say the imaginative was about someone who was trying to find their identity. They felt lost, right? You still want to make that the concern of the persuasive. So you have a speech about finding your identity and why that might be hard. And then you could have a discursive with a speaker who is reflecting, using anecdotes, that's a common one, or stream of consciousness style, which is more fitting to the discursive, where they're talking about and reflecting on how they've lost their sense of self. All three pieces are going to thread together because of that common theme, those common concerns. You can have effectively a very similar voice in terms of who's speaking. It can be from the same person. So you keep all of that as similar as you can, but you have those variations in terms of formatting, and you need to have prepped, we now know, a draft for each one of those, but make sure you start with that initial one that you prefer and then branch out to the other two. That would be my advice.
Yeah, and I think, look, we can caveat all of this by also just warning that you're going to go into the exam and you won't be able to write that pre-prepared verbatim most likely. Okay, you're going to go in there, you might have to use a distinctive voice from a text you studied, which you can safeguard yourself for, but say that's not what you had prepared. Or you might have to use an opening from what they've given you. So some of what you have pre-prepared will be relinquished. And I find when I teach really high-performing students for this, they really hate Module C because they feel like, oh, I can't be secure knowing that I'm going to use what I've pre-prepared. But you have to find a little bit of comfort in that. There is going to be some candid writing in this exam. But the best thing that you can do, as we've framed, is to be efficient in your approach. Start with the one preferred form of writing that you have and have the variations in length. And at least then plan, okay, if I was adapting this to one of the different forms, so you have a primary, imaginative, and now you're going to turn it to a persuasive or a discursive, at least do some practice writing where you have tested that and you know how you would go about it, keeping the same ideas. And that way we're streamlining your focus and we're making sure that your study is efficient. You don't want to overwhelm yourself with too many ideas, too many practices, and you also don't want to go into the exam with nothing pre-prepared, because we know there are students out here who are doing really beautiful writing with something they have pre-prepared, but they're just good at adapting it. So reflecting on this as a whole and reflecting on the lessons to be learned from last year's paper, know that we can indeed have to do 20 marks worth of composition, and they can specify the kind of writing that you'll be doing. And the best way to prepare yourself for that is to have your preferred piece, know how you would adjust it to different mark allocations, and know how you would adapt it to different text types. And I think that's probably, did you want to add?
I'll add two things just to finish, because Leila actually mentioned a really key point there, that once you make those variations, you have to test them against difficult stimuli, right? Let's emphasize that. We wanted to 5 questions, let's say, for the persuasive, the imaginative, the discursive, and the lead up, and make them as tricky as possible. Get your teacher to give you the hardest questions they can think of, and then see if your prepared ideas, concerns, and the actual piece itself can stand up against it. And often it will be able to. It's actually more about, it's not about exposing a flaw in the writing. It's about getting you to think about how you could adapt to different types of questions and stimuli. So it's not about, if it doesn't work, I need to change it. It actually isn't going to hold up against these questions. No, it is. It's actually just forcing you to get comfortable using a stimulus, thinking about stimuli, and being able to use a question in a way that suits what you have in those compositions. So be comfortable with the compositions, but I feel like I wouldn't be too confident with them unless I've seen a whole array of questions that I have then thought about how I would make that stimulus in question work.
Yeah. It's about putting yourself in the worst case scenario that you wouldn't want to be in the exam and confronting that before the exam. And there are so many benefits to that. You'll be less nervous walking in there knowing I've looked at the worst case scenario question and I know that my composition can stand stand up to that, as Jonny mentioned, and psychologically having that confidence going into the exam will help you. And it's also a matter of really training yourself to think quickly under time constraints and under pressure with tricky questions. The more you expose yourself to that, the more you desensitize yourself to the exam process, especially with creative writing, because I know that's the one where you can become undone by the stimuli because it might be specific and call into question what you've pre-prepared. So prepare your pieces, confront really tricky questions, put yourself in the exam situation and know all of the variations of how you could be examined. And through doing that in your preparation, we think that you should be good to go.
100%. And still have a reflection ready to go, needless to say. We're saying you could get the full composition, you have to have the reflection as well. That can be more thoroughly memorized and it's a lot more reliable with the draft materials there to apply. Just use the key terms of the question and you should be right to go.
Yeah. Thanks guys for watching. If you did enjoy the content, please do like and subscribe to the channel. Any questions, please do comment below and we'll get back to you. And if you are wanting more resources to enhance your studies in the year ahead, if you're looking for exemplar responses, close analysis on a plethora of texts, which has been informed by state rank achievers and HSC English markers, check out our website at Ignite HSC. You will not regret it. But for now, thank you so much for watching and we'll see you in the next video.
See you guys.